The clock above the counter read 9:47. My bus left at 10. I wiped my hands on my apron and prayed for no delays tonight. I clocked out, pushed through the back door into the rain, and started walking fast toward the corner where the bus always stopped. That's when I saw him, an older man in a gray windbreaker, swaying once, then dropping hard onto the wet concrete. I dropped to my knees beside him, checked his breathing, and shouted for anyone nearby to call for help. Behind us, my bus pulled up, doors hissing open. I didn't move. I wasn't leaving him on the ground alone. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later. I stayed until the paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher and thanked me by name. By the time I walked back into the diner, soaked and shaking slightly, my shift had ended 30 minutes ago without me. Roy was already waiting by the register, arms crossed, staring at the clock like it owed him an explanation instead of me. "Where were you?" he said. Not a question, an accusation already decided before I'd said a single word back. I told him about the man on the sidewalk. He didn't blink. "That's not my problem," he said. "You left your post." He slid a write-up form across the counter and told me my next check would be short. I signed it without a word. A young waitress named Maritza watched from the pass-through window, saying nothing, her hands frozen around a stack of plates. 9 days passed. I worked every shift Roy assigned me, said little, and never mentioned the man on the sidewalk again. Then one afternoon, a black car pulled up outside the diner, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They walked straight to the counter and asked for the cook who helped the man collapse outside 2 weeks ago. Roy laughed it off. "She's just kitchen staff," he said. "I doubt she's who you're looking for." One of the men said a name that made Roy's smirk falter. Mr. Pruitt asked for her personally, by name. Roy's face went pale. He had never once connected the man who owned this diner to the name Pruitt. The diner door chimed. A man in a gray windbreaker walked in, leaning lightly on a wooden cane. He looked straight at me and smiled. "There you are," he said. "I've been looking for you for 2 weeks. My name is Denise Okonkwo, and until that rainy Tuesday, I had never once thought of myself as anyone worth looking for. I'd worked the line at Pruitt's Diner on 5th for 6 years, the kind of job where you learn to move fast, say little, and keep your head down when the manager is in a mood. Roy Kessler had been running that diner for 3 of those years, and in 3 years, he had never once asked me how my day was going. He asked about clock-in times. He asked about ticket speed. He never asked about anything else. I didn't mind the work itself. I liked the rhythm of it, the hiss of the flat top, the calls from the pass-through window, the particular kind of quiet that settles over a kitchen during the dinner rush when everyone knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing. What I minded was Roy's habit of treating every minute of my life outside that kitchen as something he was entitled to control. That Tuesday started like any other. Rain had been coming down since the lunch shift, steady and cold, the kind that soaks through a jacket and under a block. I watched the clock behind the counter the way I always did near the end of a shift, doing the quiet math I'd done 1,000 times before, how fast I needed to walk, how many minutes I had to spare, what would happen if I missed the 10 o'clock bus and had to wait 40 more minutes in the rain for the next one. I clocked out at 9:47. 13 minutes to make a 6-minute walk. I should have made it easily. I told myself that as I pushed through the back door into the rain, apron still tied at my waist because I hadn't bothered to take it off, my mind already 3 blocks ahead at the bus stop. I didn't know yet that the next few minutes were going to cost me more than a paycheck, or that they were going to matter more than almost anything else I'd done that year. I want to be honest about something, because this story only means what it means if I am. I didn't stop to help that man because I thought anything good would come of it. I stopped because a stranger was on the ground in the rain and nobody else on that block seemed to be moving fast enough. That's the whole reason. There wasn't a second one hiding underneath it. My father used to say that the test of a person isn't what they do when someone's watching. It's what they do when they're already running late for something they can't afford to lose, and helping means losing it anyway. I didn't think about that quote in the moment. I only thought about it much later, lying awake, replaying what happened next. But first, I need to tell you what I saw when I turned the corner onto Fifth. He was already on the ground by the time I reached the corner, one hand pressed weakly against the wet concrete, the other clutching at his chest. He was an older man, silver-haired, wearing a plain gray windbreaker that didn't tell me anything about who he was. No logo, no watch worth noticing, nothing that marked him as anyone in particular. Just a man in his 60s, alone at a bus stop, going down hard in the rain while the block around him kept moving like nothing was happening at all. I dropped my bag and went to my knees beside him before I'd even fully processed what I was doing. Sir, can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, his breathing shallow and fast. I checked his pulse the way I'd learned in a first aid course years ago, back when I thought I might go into nursing before life took me somewhere else. It was there, but it was wrong, too quick, too thin. Someone call 911. I shouted, loud enough to cut through the rain, loud enough that a man across the street finally looked up from his phone. I stayed low beside him, talking steadily, the way you're supposed to when someone's scared and confused and doesn't know what's happening to their own body. You're okay. Help's coming. Just breathe with me. That's when I heard the bus. I looked up just long enough to see it pull to the curb behind me, brakes hissing, doors sliding open with that particular sound I would have recognized anywhere, any time of day, because I'd been catching that exact bus for 6 years. It was the last one for 40 minutes. I knew that the way I knew my own name. I looked at the man's face, gray and frightened, his hand gripping weakly at my sleeve like he was afraid I'd disappear. I didn't get up. The door stayed open for a few seconds, long enough for the driver to glance out, long enough for me to understand exactly what I was choosing. And then they closed, and the bus pulled away into the rain without me. I want to say I didn't think twice about it. That wouldn't be entirely true. I thought about my empty refrigerator and the 40-minute wait for the next bus in the cold, and the shift I still technically hadn't clocked out from in Roy's mind, because I was standing on a public sidewalk instead of walking straight home like a person who knew her place in the world. But none of that outweighed the man shaking under my hands. The ambulance took 9 minutes. I counted every one of them out loud to him, quietly, so he'd have something steady to hold on to besides my sleeve. When the paramedics finally lifted him onto the stretcher, he caught my wrist with surprising strength for someone who could barely speak. Thank you, he managed. What's your name? Denise, I said. He nodded like he was filing it away somewhere important. And then they wheeled him into the ambulance, doors shutting, lights disappearing down Fifth Street. I stood there a moment longer in the rain, soaked through, my last bus gone, with no way home and no idea yet what those 2 words, my name, would end up meaning to him. By the time I walked back into the diner, it was well past 10. My uniform was soaked through, my hair flattened against my head, my sneakers squelching with every step across the checkered floor. I hadn't called ahead. I hadn't thought to. My phone had died somewhere between the ambulance leaving and the long walk back in the cold. Roy was standing by the register when I came in, arms crossed, watching me the way you watch something you've already decided is a problem. Where have you been? He said. Not a question. He never asked questions that actually wanted answers. There was a man, I started. He collapsed at the bus stop. I stayed with him until the ambulance. That's not my problem, Roy said, cutting me off before I'd finished the sentence. You clocked out at 9:47. You were supposed to be gone by 10. Instead, I've got customers asking why the kitchen's short-staffed and a mess in the walk-in nobody restocked. I understand that, I said. But there was a man on the ground, Roy. He could have died. And that's very noble of you, he said, in a tone that made the word noble sound like an insult. But this is a business. I can't run a diner on good intentions. I didn't argue further. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Roy only gave him more material to repeat later, twisted slightly worse each time he told it. I stood there, dripping onto the tile, and let him finish. He pulled a form from behind the counter, a written warning, the second one I'd gotten in 3 years, the first one over a shift swap that hadn't even been my fault, and slid it across to me along with a pen. This goes in your file, he said, and I'm docking Thursday's check for the hours you missed at close. I signed it. My hand was steady. I've had a lot of practice keeping my hand steady in moments like that one. From behind the pass-through window, I caught Maritza watching, a stack of clean plates frozen halfway to the rack, her mouth slightly open like she wanted to say something and couldn't find the nerve. She was 22, still new enough to need this job more than she needed to challenge Roy over someone else's write-up. I didn't blame her for staying quiet. I understood it completely. I walked home that night in wet shoes, 40 extra minutes added to what should have been a 15-minute walk, thinking about the man's face in the rain, the way his hand had gripped my wrist, the way he'd asked for my name like it mattered. I didn't know yet that it would. I only knew that Roy's write-up was sitting in my file, and that Thursday's check was going to be short, and that none of it changed whether I would have done the exact same thing again. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Toledo, the third of 4 kids, with a father who fixed refrigerators for a living and a mother who cleaned offices at night. Neither of them had much, but they had a rule that outlasted every hard year we ever went through. If you see someone in trouble, you stop. You don't check what it costs you first. You check what it costs them if you don't. I watched my father live that rule more times than I could count. Pulling over on the highway shoulder to help strangers change a tire in the rain, staying 2 extra hours after a repair call because an elderly customer just wanted someone to talk to. He never once asked what he'd get out of it. I used to ask him that, as a kid, half joking. He'd just say, "That's not the question, Denise. The question is whether you could live with yourself if you walked past." I carried that rule with me through nursing prerequisites I never finished because the money ran out, through 2 divorces I don't discuss much, through 6 years of double shifts at diners that never once knew or cared where I came from. Roy certainly didn't. To him, I was a name on a schedule and a line item in his labor budget. I didn't need him to see anything more than that. I'd made peace with being underestimated a long time ago. There's a strange kind of freedom in it, actually. People who assume you're nothing special rarely bother watching closely enough to notice when you're doing something quietly extraordinary. What I didn't expect, walking home soaked through that night, was that someone had been watching after all. The days that followed blurred into the usual rhythm: grill, ticket rail, dish pit, walk home, repeat. Roy kept his distance in the particular way managers do after they've written you up, like he was daring me to give him a second reason. I gave him nothing. I showed up early. I stayed late without complaint. I said, "Yes, chef," to instructions that didn't deserve the title, because dignity, I've learned, isn't about winning every exchange. Sometimes it's simply about not letting someone else's smallness shrink you down to their size. Maritza started leaving me the good coffee from the back, the stuff Roy kept locked in his office for himself, sliding a cup my way during the slow hours without a word, like a quiet apology for a silence she still wasn't brave enough to break out loud. I appreciated it more than she probably realized. Some people show you where their conscience lives through small gestures instead of speeches. On the 9th day, Roy told the morning crew a story he'd clearly been telling for a while, some version where I'd wandered off mid-shift over a minor situation outside, and he'd had to scramble to cover the kitchen alone. It wasn't true. It wasn't even close to true. But I didn't correct him in front of everyone. I let it sit there the way I let most things sit, because I'd learned that some corrections land better later from someone other than me. I had no idea how soon that later was going to arrive. The black car pulled up outside the diner on a gray Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of the lunch lull, when the dining room was quiet enough that everyone noticed it immediately. 2 men got out, dark suits, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that comes from never having had to rush for anyone in their lives. They walked in together, scanned the room once, and went straight to the counter where Roy was restocking the register drawer. "We're looking for one of your employees," the taller one said. "A woman who assisted a man who collapsed outside 2 weeks ago. Tuesday the 14th, around 10 p.m. Roy straightened up, immediately proprietary the way he always got around anyone who looked like they might matter. "That'd be Denise," he said, waving a hand toward the kitchen without much interest. "She's just one of my line cooks. I doubt she's who you're looking for, though. You sure you've got the right diner?" "We're sure," the second man said. "Can I ask what this is about?" Roy said, already reaching for his clipboard like it might make him look more official. "Mr. Pruitt asked us to find her personally. the taller man said. He's been asking about her every day since the hospital discharged him. Roy blinked. Pruitt, he repeated slowly, like the word had just landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Walter Pruitt, the man said, watching Roy's face with something close to mild curiosity. Founder of Pruitt Family Diners. He owns this location, along with 62 others across 4 states. I wasn't at the counter to see Roy's face in that exact moment, but Maritza told me about it later, in detail, more than once, because she said she'd never seen a person go that pale that fast in her life. Roy had worked for this company for 11 years and never once made the connection between the founder's name on the corporate letterhead and the man he'd waved off 2 weeks earlier as not his problem. He came to get me himself, which he had never once done in 3 years. His voice, when he called my name through the kitchen doorway, sounded different than I'd ever heard it. Careful, almost polite, like he was handling something he suddenly understood could break. Denise, he said. There's someone here to see you. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked out from behind the line, still in my apron, still smelling like the grill, with absolutely no idea what was waiting for me. I want to be honest, my first thought wasn't hope. It was worry. In my experience, well-dressed strangers showing up to ask for you by name rarely meant something good. Then the door chimed, and I saw who was standing there, leaning lightly on a plain wooden cane, wearing the same gray windbreaker I remembered from the rain. There you are, Walter Pruitt said, and smiled at me like we were old friends meeting for coffee instead of 2 strangers standing in a diner 2 weeks after I'd knelt beside him in the rain. Mr. Pruitt, I said, because by then Roy's stunned expression had told me everything I needed to know about who I was looking at. You're okay. Because of you, he said. The doctors told me another 10 minutes out there, and it might have gone very differently. I've been trying to track you down since the day I got discharged. Took my assistant longer than I expected. Apparently there are 3 Pruitt's Diners locations on 5th Street in 3 different states. He laughed, a warm, easy sound. You never told the paramedics your last name. Just Denise. It took some doing. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the only true thing I had. I'm glad you're all right. I am, he said. No thanks to how fast that bus left without you, from what my assistant tells me. He talked to a few people on that block afterward. Word travels. He looked past me then, toward Roy, who was standing very still near the register, clipboard forgotten at his side. You're the manager here, Walter said. It wasn't really a question. Yes, sir. Roy Kessler. It's an honor to finally. How has Denise been treated? Walter said, cutting him off gently but completely. Since the night she missed her bus taking care of me? The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear the fryer humming in the kitchen. Roy opened his mouth once, then closed it, clearly recalculating every answer he might give in real time. It was Maritza who spoke first, stepping out from behind the counter with a stack of napkins still in her hand, her voice shaking slightly, but clear. She got written up, she said, for missing curfew by like 20 minutes. And he docked her paycheck. I've been wanting to say something for weeks. She glanced at Roy. I was scared. Walter turned back to me, his expression unreadable for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly, like something had just been confirmed that he'd already half suspected. Denise, he said quietly, I'd like you to walk with me outside for a minute. There's someone I'd like you to talk to on the phone. I glanced at Roy on my way past him. He didn't meet my eyes. For the first time since I'd known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. Walter's assistant handed me his phone the moment we stepped outside under the diner's front awning, rain still falling lightly on the street beyond it. On the other end was a woman who introduced herself as the head of HR for Pruitt Family Diners corporate office. Ms. Okonkwo, she said, I understand you may have some concerns about how you've been treated at your location. Mr. Pruitt has asked me to open a formal review, effective immediately. I hadn't asked for that. I want to be clear about that part, because it matters. I hadn't called anyone, hadn't filed a complaint, hadn't done anything except kneel beside a stranger in the rain because it was the right thing to do. But apparently, once Walter Pruitt understood what had happened to me afterward, he wasn't the kind of man who let it go unexamined. There's something else, she continued. This isn't the first complaint we've received about Mr. Kessler's management style. We've had 3 prior write-ups filed against employees at that location over the past 2 years, 2 of which were later found, on internal review, to lack sufficient documentation to justify the discipline given. We hadn't connected the pattern until now. I looked back through the diner window. Roy was standing exactly where I'd left him, staring at nothing, his clipboard hanging loose at his side like it had suddenly become useless. Walter, standing beside me under the awning, hadn't said much since we'd stepped outside. When I finally handed the phone back, he studied my face for a moment. "You didn't ask for any of this," he said. "I know that. I'm not doing it to reward you, exactly, though I hope it feels that way eventually. I'm doing it because a man who treats his staff the way your manager treated you after what you did for me isn't a man who should be trusted to run a diner with my name on it. This isn't about gratitude. It's about what I'd have found eventually, whether or not you'd helped me that night. You just happened to be the reason I looked sooner." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, fully, even now. "There's a security camera above the register in there," he added. "Corporate keeps 90 days of footage on file. I imagine it'll show exactly what Maritza described." It did. I found that out a week later, along with everything else. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, a regional director I'd never met before showed up at the diner unannounced, pulled the security footage from the night in question, and sat with Maritza and 2 other staff members for what she called a standard workplace review, though nobody in that kitchen believed for a second it was standard. The footage showed exactly what had happened: Roy sliding the write-up across the counter, refusing to let me finish a sentence about the man I'd stopped to help, docking my check in front of 2 customers who'd clearly overheard the whole exchange and looked uncomfortable about it even at the time. It also showed, further back in the file, 2 other incidents corporate hadn't previously flagged: Roy dismissing a request for a scheduling accommodation from a pregnant employee the year before, and cutting another cook's hours after a disagreement over a broken fryer that hadn't actually been her fault. None of it painted the picture of a single bad night. It painted a pattern, the kind that gets easier to see once someone finally bothers to look. Roy was placed on administrative leave the same day the review concluded. I heard through Maritza, 3 weeks later, that it became permanent. I didn't ask for details beyond that. I'd learned by then that watching someone lose something doesn't actually feel the way you'd expect it to. There's no real satisfaction in it. Just a quiet sense that something that should have happened a long time ago had finally happened. What I hadn't expected was the rest of it. The regional director called me into what used to be Roy's office, smaller than I remembered it looking from the outside, and told me corporate had reviewed my personnel file in full. The 2 prior write-ups, including the one for the man I'd helped, were being formally removed. My dock pay was being reissued in full, with an additional amount she called an inconvenience adjustment that made me laugh a little, quietly, because it was such a careful corporate way of saying we're sorry. And then she told me something I hadn't expected at all. Mr. Pruitt had personally asked whether I'd be interested in a shift lead position, with input on hiring for the location going forward. I told her I'd think about it. I meant it. Some decisions, even good ones, deserve more than a reflex answer. I saw Walter Pruitt one more time before that story fully closed, about a month later, when he came back to the diner on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, dressed the same way he'd been the night I met him. Plain windbreaker, worn loafers, nothing about him that would tell a stranger he owned 63 restaurants across 4 states. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and waited until my break to talk to me properly. "I heard you took the shift lead position," he said. "I did," I said. "Effective last week." "Good," he said, and there was real warmth in it. Not the polished kind people perform for cameras, but the plain kind that comes from someone who's genuinely glad about something small. I also heard Maritza's getting a raise, and that the new manager actually reads the schedule requests before rejecting them. "He does," I said. "It's been a strange month." Walter turned his coffee cup slowly on its saucer, thinking for a moment before he spoke again. "I want to be honest with you about something, Denise, because I think you'd see through it if I wasn't. I didn't do any of this to reward a good deed. Rewards make people suspicious of their own kindness. Like they only did the right thing hoping something like this would happen. That's not what this was. Then what was it? I asked, genuinely curious. It was an audit, he said simply. You showed me exactly what kind of manager Roy Kessler was, without either of us intending it. That night told me something about my own company I should have known already, that somewhere along the line, we let a location get run by someone who treated his people like line items instead of human beings. I would have found that out eventually. You just happened to be the reason I found out in time to fix it before it went on longer. I thought about my father then, about refrigerators fixed for free and highway shoulders in the rain, about the particular freedom of doing the right thing without checking first what it might cost you. I didn't stop that night because I thought anything would come of it. I told him. I know, Walter said. That's exactly why something did. Roy Kessler's termination became final 11 days after his administrative leave began. I learned later, through the regional HR director, that the internal review had turned up enough documented pattern, 3 separate incidents in 18 months, all involving employees with the least power to push back, that the company's legal team recommended immediate separation rather than a lesser disciplinary step. He didn't contest it. There wasn't much left to contest once the security footage had been reviewed alongside the written complaints already sitting quietly in his file. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something closer to relief, the kind that comes when a low, constant hum you'd stopped noticing finally goes quiet, and you realize how much energy you'd been spending just tuning it out. Maritza told me Roy tried to explain himself once, near the end, standing in the parking lot with his box of desk items, telling the regional director that he'd only ever been following procedure, that rules existed for a reason, that he couldn't run a diner on good intentions. It was almost exactly what he'd said to me that rainy night, word for word, like the last 3 years had taught him nothing at all. The new manager, a woman named Priscilla who transferred in from a location 2 towns over, spent her first week just listening. To the staff, to the scheduled complaints that had been piling up for months, to Maritza's quiet account of what the last few years had actually been like working under Roy. She read every write-up in the file, including the 2 corporate had already flagged for removal, and asked me directly what I thought the kitchen needed. Nobody had asked me that in 6 years. I told her the truth. People who show up and do the work deserve managers who notice when something in their life outside that kitchen matters. She wrote it down. I don't know if that sounds small to anyone hearing this story secondhand. It didn't feel small to me. The scheduling accommodation Roy had denied the pregnant employee the year before, a woman named Dana, who'd since had her baby and come back part-time, was reinstated within the month. Nobody had to ask twice. 6 months after that rainy Tuesday, I stood in the same diner in a different position than the one I'd started in, training a new hire on the grill the way I'd once been trained myself, back when I still thought this job was just a way to get from one paycheck to the next. It had become something else somewhere along the way. Not because Walter Pruitt had walked back through that door, and not because Roy Kessler had finally faced consequences that were years overdue. It became something else because I'd learned, in the space of a few strange weeks, that the version of dignity my father had taught me above a laundromat in Toledo still held up in the real world, decades later, in a diner on 5th Street, in the rain. I think about that bus sometimes, the one that pulled away while I knelt on the wet concrete, doors closing on a version of that night where I made the easier choice instead. I don't know what would have happened to Walter Pruitt if I'd caught it. I don't know how long Roy Kessler would have kept running that diner the way he ran it, unquestioned, unreviewed, quietly grinding down anyone without the standing to push back. I only know the version of that night that actually happened, and I don't regret a single minute of the 40 extra ones it cost me. Maritza got promoted to assistant manager under Priscilla 2 months later. She still slides me the good coffee sometimes, out of habit more than necessity now, and we laugh about it, because neither of us needs to hide anything from anyone in that kitchen anymore. Walter still comes by every few months, always dressed the same plain way, always ordering the same slice of pie. He never makes it a spectacle. He just sits at the counter, asks how things are going, and listens like the answer actually matters to him. Last week he told me the company was starting a formal review process across all 63 locations. anonymous employee surveys, quarterly check-ins with corporate HR, direct channels for complaints that don't have to go through a location manager first. He said it started with one conversation in a rainy parking lot outside a diner on 5th Street. I told him it started before that. It started with a father who fixed refrigerators for free and never once asked what it would cost him. People ask me sometimes, when they hear this story secondhand, whether I ever think about what would have happened if I'd made the bus that night instead. If I'd looked at that man on the ground and told myself someone else would stop, that I couldn't afford to lose 40 minutes and a night's peace over a stranger who wasn't my responsibility. I understand why they ask. It's a reasonable question. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, aren't entirely sure what they'd do in that exact moment. Rain coming down, bus doors closing, a decision that has to be made in about 4 seconds with no time to weigh the consequences properly. But I don't think about it that way, because I don't think the story is really about the bus at all. The story is about what happens to a person's character when nobody's watching and there's genuinely nothing to gain. And then, separately, about what happens to an organization when someone finally looks closely enough to notice how it treats the people with the least power inside it. Those are two different stories that happen to collide on one rainy sidewalk. I didn't plan for them to. I don't think Walter did either, not really. I think he was just a man having a heart episode who happened to be helped by someone who didn't ask any questions first, and who happened, afterward, to care enough about what happened to that person to actually look. Roy Kessler wasn't fired because he was cruel to me specifically. He was fired because when corporate finally looked at the full pattern, 3 employees, 18 months, documented complaints that had been sitting quietly in a file nobody bothered to open until someone with enough standing asked them to. The picture that emerged wasn't one bad night. It was a manager who had learned, over years, that nobody below him was going to push back hard enough to matter. That's the part one hope people actually take from this, more than the twist of who Walter turned out to be. Dignity isn't something that only shows up once you've been vindicated. It's something you either practice consistently, in small unglamorous moments nobody's filming, or you don't practice at all. I practiced it in the rain on a Tuesday night for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. Everything that happened afterward was just the world, for once, catching up to that. There's a small detail I haven't mentioned yet, one Walter told me the last time he came by. Apparently, in the weeks after his discharge from the hospital, before his assistant tracked me down, he told the story of that night to nearly everyone he worked with, his executive team, his board, even a reporter doing a small feature on the company's 40th anniversary. He never mentioned my name, because he didn't have it yet, but he described the moment in detail every time. A stranger who watched her only bus pull away rather than leave him alone on the sidewalk. He said something changed in the way people around him listened after that. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so plain. No dramatic rescue. No heroics. Just a woman choosing to stay on her knees in the rain instead of getting on a bus she couldn't afford to miss. I think about that sometimes, how such a small, quiet decision ended up traveling so far beyond the sidewalk where it happened. Into boardrooms, into a company-wide review, into Maritz's promotion and Dana's restored schedule, and a new manager who actually reads the file before she judges anyone in it. I still wear the same watch I was wearing that night. It's nothing special, steel band, scratched face, the kind you can buy for $20 at any drugstore. My father gave it to me the year I finished my first year of nursing prerequisites, the year before the money ran out, and I had to stop. I kept it through every job since, not because it tells better time than a phone would, but because every time I glance at it, I remember what he used to say about the question that actually matters. Not what does helping cost you. What does it cost the other person if you don't? I don't know what happened to Roy Kessler after he left that parking lot with his box of desk items. I don't spend much time wondering. Some doors close on their own, quietly, the moment someone stops being able to hide behind a title. What I know is that the diner on 5th Street runs differently now. And I know that somewhere in this city, on some ordinary rainy night, someone else is going to have 4 seconds to decide whether to catch their bus or kneel down beside a stranger. I hope they kneel. A year later, Pruitt Family Diners rolled out what corporate started calling, a little clumsily, the Fifth Street Standard, a set of formal protections for hourly staff across all 63 locations. Guaranteed paid time for documented emergencies, a direct anonymous line to corporate HR that didn't route through a location manager first, and a policy explicitly stating that assisting someone in a medical emergency could never be grounds for disciplinary action, no matter how it affected a shift. I wasn't in the room when they voted on it, but Walter called me the day it passed, sounding more pleased about it than I'd heard him about almost anything else. "You should know," he said. "The board named it after your diner. Not after you specifically. I checked with you first, and you were right not to want your name on it." But everyone on that call knew exactly which story we were talking about. I told him that felt right. This was never supposed to be about me individually. It was about what happens when the people running an organization actually bother to find out how it treats the people at the bottom of it, instead of assuming the numbers on a spreadsheet tell the whole truth. Roy Kessler, as far as I know, found work eventually at a different restaurant group 2 counties over. I don't wish him harm. I hope, honestly, that somewhere along the way he learned something from what happened, though I have no way of knowing whether he did. Some people learn from consequences. Others just get better at avoiding the specific mistake that caught up with them the first time, without ever touching the deeper habit underneath it. Maritza runs the Fifth Street location now, full manager, promoted twice in 18 months. She still keeps a small note taped inside the office door, one she wrote herself the week after Roy left. "Ask before you assume." I see it every time I walk past. Priscilla, who trained her, moved on to open a new location downtown. Before she left, she told me something I've held on to since, that the measure of a manager isn't how smoothly things run when everyone's compliant and grateful. It's how they handle the one employee who does something inconvenient for a reason that turns out to be right. I think about that whenever I train someone new on the grill now. I tell them the same thing my father told me, in different words, adjusted for a kitchen instead of a repair shop. The job matters, but it was never supposed to matter more than the person standing next to it. People love a story with a clean twist in it. The stranger who turns out to own the building, the quiet cook who turns out to matter more than anyone realized. I understand the appeal. I felt it myself, standing in that diner the day Walter walked back through the door leaning on his cane, watching Roy's face change in real time as he understood exactly who he'd dismissed 2 weeks earlier. But if I'm being honest with you, the twist was never really the point, not to me. The point was simpler and, I think, more useful than any twist could be. I didn't know who Walter Pruitt was when I knelt down beside him in the ring. I didn't check first. I didn't calculate what it might cost or gain me. I just saw someone who needed help and gave it, the same way I would have given it to anyone. The same way my father taught me to give it to anyone, 63 restaurants or none at all, famous or completely unknown, grateful afterward or not. That's the part one hopes stays with anyone hearing this. Not that kindness sometimes gets rewarded, though I won't pretend it doesn't feel good when it does. It's that kindness has to work the same way whether or not it ever gets rewarded, or it isn't really kindness. It's just a transaction wearing a nicer coat. Roy Kessler ran that diner for 3 years believing that rules were rules, that punctuality mattered more than people, that a written warning was simply the cost of doing business the right way. He wasn't wrong that businesses need structure. He was wrong about what structure is actually for. It's supposed to protect people, not punish them for being decent on company time. I still work the line most days, though I run the kitchen now more than I cook in it. Maritza and I still laugh about the good coffee. Dana's daughter came by the diner last month in a stroller, and half the staff took turns holding her during the lull between lunch and dinner. Walter still stops in every few months for the same slice of pie, always dressed the same. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next dramatic story. Tap like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.